Well, good morning, everyone. Okay, now as you can tell, it's true you're waiting till the end to ask questions, but I do need to feel that you're with me as we go on this journey. So I have the great pleasure for a few minutes to talk to you about the joy and rigor of research. I know research is something that everybody really loves and is really excited about and couldn't wait to get here this morning to find out a better way to do it. I must also say that as I go through the slides and as I talk to you about coherence and research, I have one caveat that all students must remember, irrespective of how I present this coherence, the way that your supervisor guides you is what's controlling. So this is not coming here and saying, oh, well, Dr. Ruffin said. No, okay. So, but these are just some ideas and these are some things that have worked for me. All right, so now the first step, of course, is trying to figure out what your research topic is going to be. And I find these 5 points to be very important. You want your research to be about an issue that matters. Remember, your issue or your research is not just for you. It's not just about your degree, although I know you're pretty much focused on that. It's also about how can the issues, the problems, the needs of the South African context, the African continental context, the global context, how can the research that we conduct provide information that's going to bring change and information that's going to improve the conditions under which we live. So there are a lot of issues out there are a lot of problems, but in choosing the one that you decide upon, you also want to think about what passion do you have about that particular topic. I suggest that you don't pick a topic that you're not really interested in or that you're going to find boring, because you're going to need passion to keep you on that road and to keep you busy collecting data, analyzing data, or as the case may be, all the way through to the finish line. So these 5 points are very important. Coming up with an issue that matters, a real problem. We don't need a research study about something that we already know. We want to know about things that we don't know. And we want to know about how these problems can be solved and how the scientific method can help us solve those problems. Research component alignment. So let me talk to you about this for a few minutes. First of all, of course, yes, we know we have to have a topic. We know we have to have ethical protocols. We need an ontological and epistemological theme or worldview that's underlying the study. If we need a research question or a hypothesis, whatever the problem may be. Generally, a research question you definitely need if you're doing a mixed methods or a qualitative study. A hypothesis you definitely need if you're conducting a quantitative study, or even if you're doing a mixed method study with both qualitative and quantitative. Now, even though the literature review is 4th in this line, we must always remember that the literature review is really of utmost importance. We don't want to come up with an idea of what we think is a problem and then go to the literature and find out there's either insufficient information or what we thought was a problem has already been solved. So the first point of departure is really the literature. That's really the first point of departure, to go there, research different topics, and find out what the state of the literature is, where the gaps are, what is it that we still need to find out, and then happily, you will also find methods that other researchers have used. So then you can get better ideas of what kind of methodology you want to use, or what worked in a particular study, and why it is that you are choosing or not choosing that. So the literature review in some ways controls in terms of identifying where your study is going to live, because every study has to have a home. Every study has to have a place where you're showing how you are adding to an existing body of knowledge and hopefully creating new knowledge. Research design, strategies, paradigms. More alignment. It's important here that whatever research design that you choose, that is really the literature review and the research question and the hypothesis that's telling you what kind of design you can use. I mean, you can't just pick a design because you like that type of methodology or that type of design that goes along with it. So this is what we mean by coherence. Each one has to talk to each other. As far as the strategies, well, there are a lot of different strategies in terms of how you're going to execute the research. However, the strategy has to match the research design. The research design has to be called upon through the research question and the research problem and the research objectives, and the literature review has to guide your designation of the research problem, the research question, and the research objectives. So are we getting into the alignment yet? I'm checking the pulse beat now. Okay. So then, of course, there's data collection, analysis, and presentation. We want to be careful not to confuse the research design with actual data collection methods, because sometimes that can be confusing because the names are the same. So we have to understand what the design is asking us to do, and then what the actual methods of going out to collect the data is telling us to do. And of course, there's the analysis. The analysis has to match, and we're just going right back up the line, the data analysis, which came from the research design strategy and paradigms based on what came out of the literature review to give you the research problem, the research question, and objectives, which told you what you needed to do in terms of research design. So now I'm going to go through each one of those a little bit more, but before I do, let's talk about this question. Why ethical clearance? Why do we have to break our neck trying to get a gatekeeper's letter, sometimes from places that are very challenging, sometimes from places that we know the study is needed, but they may not realize the benefit of a free study? That's one of the ways we've been selling the idea. Because really, these organizations, whether it's a business, whether it's government, whether it's an NGO, this is an opportunity for them to have a free scientific study accomplished by the student under the supervision of the supervisor, under the component of UKZN, which is, of course, a research-led opportunity, university. So that's one of the ways that we sell it. But let's look at why we really need ethical clearance. When we talk about protection of human subjects, that's not by accident. How many people are familiar with the Tuskegee experiment? Okay, one? Okay, we're going to share with them about the Tuskegee experiment. With the Tuskegee experiment, it came to light that for 40 years, the United States government was conducting human research using human beings as guinea pigs, infecting men with syphilis, and waiting until they died so that they could check the autopsies to find out the effect of syphilis on the human body. That's the Tuskegee experiment. It's worth looking into. For 40 years, over 400 people went through this. And when it came to light, this was around 1972. This is recent. It's not eons ago. And then when it came to light, the importance of human subject protection, of course, became even more evident. Even before the Tuskegee experiment were the Nuremberg trials at the end of World War II, from which came the Nuremberg Code. Check it out. Within the Nuremberg Code is the requirement of our dear friend, informed consent. Yes. And this is because of the situation with Germany and the Jews and what happened during the Holocaust and after World War II in terms of the way that people were treated in research, again, that was done on human beings without their consent. So it's a really big deal having informed consent, making sure that everyone who participates in your study signs the form, that you bring that home with you or to your supervisor, whatever the case may be, for every participant in the study. And I know it seems cumbersome, especially when we're doing things that we feel like, oh, the people aren't vulnerable, or it really doesn't matter, because the process may be different for each type of level or type of risk, but what's important is that we protect human beings. So let's shift a little bit, talk a little bit about ontology and epistemology. Now, before I even do that, always remember, when you're getting into this philosophical worldview that underlies your study, think about how the study that we conduct is really reflective of the mission, the vision, the goals, the objectives, the values of our university, of our college, of our school. So again, you're not working in silo. So know what those visions, missions are, especially when it comes time for you to apply for funding, because you have to explain how it is that what you're doing is carrying all of these out. But don't do it just because you need it for funding. Do it because you want to develop a belief in them. You want to get some kind of buy-in into the vision that you're a part of, that you're carrying out. All right, so ontology. Ontology deals with the basic assumptions or the nature of reality. So there are many different ontological viewpoints out there. But every study has an ontological or an epistemological viewpoint, whether the scholar says it or not. It's there. So nowadays, we're looking at it from the framework of understanding how to make that part of the coherence. So the ontology looks at the philosophical question about what is reality? What is the state of being? Yes, it's a very metaphysical, Twilight Zone type of situation where you really have to be contemplative and reflective and all that good stuff. For example, how do you believe that human beings came into being? For you, if a tree falls in the forest, does it still make a noise even though no human being heard it? Are you more anthropologically inclined or anthropocentric, where you feel like unless it affects a human being, it doesn't matter? Or do you feel that certain spirits live in the ocean or live in the river, or the trees have energy? So all these things, believe it or not, come to play in your ontological underlay of research. Epistemology. Now, while ontology talks to us about the state of being, or how we function in the universe as a state of being, epistemology says to us, what do we know, what can we know, and how can we know it? Because at different times in the evolution of the world, some things have counted as knowledge and some things have not. For example, now we're very focused on capturing African indigenous knowledge systems, indigenous systems of governance, indigenous healthcare aspects. But there were times when these things didn't count as knowledge. It was more so looked as if it's something that really was not effective. But yet we find the pharmaceutical companies going to these very herbs and taking advantage of these traditional aspects, but bottling it and packaging it differently. So in our research, we want to make sure that it's clear what our beliefs are in terms of what counts as knowledge and what can be known. Also, there's a relationship between knowledge and reality in terms of the epistemology and ontological reunion. Epistemology also asks us, what is truth? Is there only one? Is there only one absolute truth in the universe, and that's how we all have to function? Or are there multiple truths? Now, we know if we're conducting a study that looks into the perceptions of people, there are going to be multiple truths. Just because one person perceives it one way and another person perceives it another does not necessarily mean who's right or who's wrong. But the researcher has to be able to capture all of this and be able to analyze it in a way where it demonstrates what the perceptions are revealing and not what, of course, the researcher thinks. So let's talk a little bit about research paradigms. And how am I? Okay, good. Okay. So, research paradigm. Wow. Okay, I don't want to stay here too long, but I really like this part. Okay. All right, so now with the research paradigm, we have to think about what is the overarching perspective concerning our research. Now, this is a reflective situation. This is not just to hurry up and finish the proposal and get it to given so you can move on to the next step. We have to think about these things. We have to be intellectually stimulated by these things. We want to discuss it with our peers, discuss it with your colleagues, discuss it with your supervisor, discuss it with anybody who will listen. Because it's very important that you understand why it is that you're moving the way you are and the underlying worldviews. For example, positivism is a very famous paradigm. It's been around for a long time. So with positivism, it has its own ontological outlook as far as the nature of reality, and it has its own epistemological outlook in terms of what can be known and whether there's one truth or multiple truths. So these are things important to be aware of. Now, briefly, these are a variety of paradigms. Believe me, it's not exhaustive. There are many more out there. But each one of these paradigms has its own ontological and epistemological framework. Post-positivism, for example, talks about critical realism. Or as you see, going into the emancipatory paradigms, you have various types of critical theory, structuralism, post-structuralism, and so on. These are the types of worldviews that are very compatible when you're seeking to understand why things exist and you want to have some kind of action research or make change in terms of solving a problem and improving the situation. So it's very important to look into these because as you're determining your paradigm, remember the paradigm is for the entire dissertation. It's for the entire thesis. It's not just a matter of methodology. It's not just about your research design. So early on, it's very important that you're describing what it is or what your approach is to the particular topic. Our friend methodology. What would we do without it? All right, how will the research undertake the study of the problem or the question, and how will it test the hypothesis? Now, even though a methodology is as important as it is, we don't want to just jump into the methodology until we understand how these different components fit together. For example, the research design. And of course, we found out our research design because the research problem or the hypothesis, the research objectives told us what the research design needs to be. The research strategy, again, is coming out of the literature review, the problem, the research questions, hypothesis, objectives, and so on, leading us to what the data collection is going to be. So in other words, I'm saying don't confuse methodology with methods. Because when we're talking about the methodology here, we're talking about the big picture and everything that lives within it. But the methods, the data collection methods, are actually what you do to get the data that you need to fit within the methodological framework. Of course, there's the data analysis, the data presentation, write-up, and way forward. So again, all of these have to talk to each other. Am I getting that point across? Okay, I just want to make sure. Okay. All right, so now let's look at the research designs. Now again, as I said, different scholars look at this different ways. I'm sure in doing all your research, you've seen the phrase, scholars disagree. And we can pretty much count on that in academia. So, but one way to look at this is that there are three types of design. One being quantitative, one being qualitative, and the other one being mixed methods that's a combination of both. But as you know, the way that we figure out which one to use is based on what the research question is. Certain questions start with certain words, and that, for example, if the question starts with how or why, that question is telling us, hey, you know what? Put me in the qualitative group. Okay? If the question deals with what or how many, things of that nature, then the question is telling you, okay, I want to go quantitative. Let your research talk to you. Don't just talk to the research. Okay? Let it establish its own voice so it can communicate with you. And then if it's going to be quantitative, as I said before, more than likely you're going to have a hypothesis, which, again, the hypothesis has to come out of that literature review, and the hypothesis has to be such that basically, after your review of the literature, you have a hunch now. You're suspecting something. You're expecting that there's a certain relationship between dependent and independent variables. Now, that's a very, very important part of the study in terms of what the dependent and independent variables are going to be when you're talking about the hypothesis that you're testing. And your supervisor will help you identify that. It's just as important as coming up with what the theoretical framework is going to be. Because if you don't get those components right, you're going to have problems later on down the line. And then it'll hit you. The light bulb will go off, which is what we don't want. So we want to make sure that you see the light now, which means that, for example, you might have a dependent variable and then 2 or 3 independent variables because your study might include a multiple regression because you're going for a quantitative study. Then more alignment, you have to make sure that those variables are fully represented in your survey instrument and that you have the correct survey options for each of those survey statements that you're using to collect that data before it goes into SPSS or STATA or whatever software you're going to use. So again, more alignment and connection between the components of the research and the coherence. So now, research strategies, it just keeps getting better and better. Okay, research strategies. Again, not an exhaustive list. But different research strategies match different research designs. Different research strategies match whatever the objectives are for your research. They match what the dependent and independent variables are for your research. They need to match what the hypothesis is for your research. So you want to go to your arsenal of strategies and use this ammunition to get the victory in your war of finishing your work. So, for example, experimental generally goes with a positivist paradigm. And a positive paradigm then takes with its ontological viewpoint about objectivity, or takes with it, there's one absolute truth. So now you see how all these things kind of go together. Quasi-experimental. It could be post-positivist, for example. Could be the research paradigm that goes along with it. The same is true when you see case study. Case study might lend itself to methods that deal with quantitative or qualitative designs, or it could even lend itself to mixed methods. But the case study is its own world in terms of a strategy. Each one of these strategies has its own state of being. Each one of these strategies requires a certain approach that you take from day one in the research, which is why the strategy must match the research design. I know I'm sounding like a broken record now. Okay, so now, moving on, data collection. In terms of data collection, now we're talking about the methods. So remember when I said the big picture is the methodology, the designs are coming in there, then the research strategies are affiliated with what the different designs are. So this is what we mean by coherence. So for example, let's say that you decide that you want to have a positivist paradigm, and then you decide you want to have an ethnographic